Foreign Affairs Committee is today holding a session in our inquiry into soft power, and we are looking at the work of the British Council. It's the first time the British Council has appeared before the committee since 2015, and we're really grateful to you for joining us today. And I wondered if, for the record, you might introduce yourselves.
My name is Kate Ewart-Biggs. I'm the Deputy CEO of the British Council. And apologies for my voice. I lost it entirely over the weekend. It's now recovered. But if
because you're an Arsenal fan.
Well, I'd like to say so, but no, just, I don't know, random. So apologies for that.
And I'm Scott McDonald. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Council.
Right, lovely. Thank you very much. And as I say, thank you ever so much for coming in. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover, really, given that we've not really seen you for such a long time and so much has happened since you were here. But I thought that perhaps the best thing to do would be to begin by just giving you an opportunity, and for people who are tuning in and paying attention to this session, they may want to know what it is that the British Council does and how the British Council supports the Foreign Office policy priorities. I wonder, Scott, would you mind, Scott McDonald, would you mind explaining that to us?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The world is a more dangerous place than it's been for some time. And 70% of people live in autocratic states. 1 in 7 people experienced conflict in the last year. There's a clash of values around the world and a battle about how we should govern and how we should live. The lines between business and politics are blurring. Disinformation is spreading everywhere, threatening democracy, and there's a real competition for the engagement and minds of young people who will be the leaders of the future. And the British Council was formed exactly 90 years ago to combat these specific conditions. You know, the 1930s was a time of competing ideologies around the world, particularly fascism. And the UK government formed the British Council so it could go out there and build trust between the people of the UK and people around the world that would support peace and prosperity. But more practically, it was supposed to support trust in the UK. So more people would visit here, more people would study here, more people would trade with us, less people would go to war with us. And over time, we've evolved into one of the main conduits for the UK's soft power, focusing primarily on culture, education, and the English language, which aren't the only components of soft power, but 3 of the main ones. And we focus on all those things I talked about, getting people to visit, study, trade, and go to war with us less. And we believe, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, some of the evidence that we contribute directly to the UK's growth and security.
I saw that it was 589 million people you claim you had some kind of contact with.
Yeah, so every year we engage around the world with about 600 million people. That's from all the countries we work with. We have a different metrics we call meaningful engagement, where they've actually participated in a program or a face-to-face event with us or a festival with us. That number is about 155 million. And we think we do that well. We'll talk about how we track it. The other point I wanted to make, though, is we think we do it in a way that's remarkable value for the UK taxpayer. The Foreign Office puts in about £165 million every year to the British Council. Yet, if you look out in the world and look at what's happening, you know, the UK gets this £1 billion soft power superpower, we think, because we're generating 85% of the income of the British Council outside the government. Yes. And that comes from either teaching or doing exams or raising money from corporates or raising money from other governments or a few other small things which we can get into. So for every pound the FCDO invests, you know, we generate another £5, which helps fund the overall machine that is the British Council. Now, one point, if I have just 2 more minutes I wanted to make before we got going, is we think all of this is at some risk, though, because of our financial challenges.
We'll get onto that. We'll get onto that later.
Okay.
Don't worry. But I also, part of my question though was also about about supporting the government's foreign policy priorities, and I wondered in what way you see yourself as being able to do that.
So I think I described the overall mission, and then as each government comes in, they have different priorities as a government and different foreign policy priorities. So this one has been very clear about their priorities around growth, security, Europe, climate, and
modernising our approach to development.
And development.
Yes.
So we organize in turn our approach behind each of those things. And the way we design our strategy and the way we execute it is to deliver those.
On the top line, growth. Everything's about growth. In what way would the British Council be contributing to the growth of our country?
So let me give you some examples, because we think we contribute in multiple ways and with very big numbers. So the first thing we do is help the sectors we work for, so primarily arts and culture and education, make international partnerships all around the world. We help plug those sectors into the 200 countries we operate in. They actually create partnerships that creates export value or other business that's going on. So that might be something like taking the Tate Turner exhibition to a museum in Shanghai. It might be one of the many cultural seasons we run around the world in places like Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Australia, or France, where we create hundreds of partnerships during that time. That sector is worth about $124 billion to the economy. It's one of the 8 sectors in the government's industrial strategy. We do the same in education, where we do work supporting the mutual recognition of qualifications, and that enables UK universities to strike deals around the world, set up campuses. We worked for many years in India, for example, setting up mutual recognition of qualifications that enabled Southampton University to be the first foreign university to set up a campus in India just before Christmas. And we do that work right across to education as well. So we estimate that brokering, introducing work is worth about £350 million a year to the UK. We support student mobility to the UK. That's worth about £40 billion, and we think we influence about 25% of the students that come here, so that's many billions of pounds. Through the exams work we do, that generates about $100 million a year in revenues for the awarding bodies in the UK. Then there's some really...
Yes, go on.
I wonder, you estimated that 25% of the overseas students arriving in the UK have been influenced by the British Council. I wonder how you measure that and what evidence do you have for that, please?
So we do many things, but 2 primary ones that bring students into the UK. So in all of our operations around the world, we're promoting the UK directly into those markets with all of the contacts we have. So we are marketing, promoting, sharing things on the UK. But probably the bigger thing is we run the Study UK portal, which gets about 7 million people a year looking at it. And then we send all those referrals into the UK universities. So that's sort of the front of the UK is us, and the front of the UK is us in the 200 countries. So we've done an evaluation study to try and estimate, and I accept that the 25 may not be that precise, but the numbers are so big. Even if the number was 20 or 15, it's many billions.
We would also work with a range of agents that are working right across the world who are supporting international students to come to the UK, and we would make sure that those are quality assessed, etc. And that's one of the big avenues that people use, and then they would credit the British Council as having given them the support that they needed in order to work better to reach more students.
But coming back to the main question too, I think there's a few really big things that are hard to measure but are important. So we support about 50 countries around the world developing their systems to teach English. And that means the whole country is better at teaching English, the teachers are better, and they'll produce many millions of people that learn English. We think that underpins a lot of trade with the UK. We haven't tried to estimate exactly what it is, but if people didn't speak English, it would be harder to trade for us. And then the final the final thing I would mention is, one of the biggest opportunities for growth the Foreign FCDO thinks in the years ahead is trade with sort of the middle ground or global south countries. And that really is the heartland of the British Council. This is where we have big, long-term operations that have been on the ground for 90 years, tons of trust that we think has an impact on how many people want to trade with the UK. So that's sort of an overview of the types of things we do on growth.
And I do appreciate that it's really difficult to measure this, but to a certain extent you've given us some statistics. In terms of the measurables or the things that can be measured, and I appreciate there are additional things that can't be measured, but how much, therefore, is there a headline figure? Are you able to say, the British Council, it is estimated, results in X amount of growth for the UK, or brings in X amount of
the hard numbers I gave you there were $350 a year in the brokering, 100 for the exams people. Those are very hard, so that's $450. If I take the 25% on the student mobility, that would be $10 billion. So let's take a tenth of that.
Yeah, you might as well.
As something for the skeptics. So that we're up to $1.5 billion. And then for the rest, I'd be confident throwing in for the teaching of English around the world and for the middle ground, another $500 million. So let's say £2 billion, I think we would be find very easy to identify.
Okay.
For an investment of $165 million.
Those headlines are very positive and good news. I want to move on to slightly bad news, though, which is about the funding and about your finances, because it does worry me. And before I do that, can I just ask you directly, how much, given the role that you play in terms of soft power and growth for our country, how much direct contact do you get with the Foreign Secretary about this?
So typically, I would meet with the Foreign Secretary twice a year. The current one has been in power for about 6 months. I've met with him once.
Okay. So on funding, your accounts for the year March 23 weren't published until March 24, and you haven't published the accounts yet for the year ending March 24. So why are your accounts so delayed? Are they usually this delayed, or is it just now that it's happening?
So since COVID, we have had an outstanding loan given to us by the government through the FCDO, and that's been rolling over on a one-year basis. And every year we don't manage to negotiate the rollover until the last possible moment. And that means we can't file our accounts until we have that rolled over, because without it, we would be insolvent. So
this year, you're supposed to be, in March this year is when you're supposed to pay the loan back, is that right? That's
right. It's when it was structured during COVID, it's roughly now a £200 million loan, and it was never designed to be paid back in the short term. We negotiated that at the time with the Foreign Secretary at the time, who was Dominic Raab, and it was immediate relief during COVID, and then the plan was eventually we would come up with an affordable repayment plan for the British Council. We still haven't done that, so each year it's just been rolled over for 1 year. Okay. Well, I think
there'll be some more questions about that a bit later, but I just wanted to understand what. So it's because of the rolling over of the loan of the loan that is the reason that you're not able to publish your accounts.
Yeah. Until the loan is signed, it's unclear that we could meet our obligations in the year ahead. Okay. So we can't file the accounts.
Some questions about financial results, I think.
When we had the Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Office before us, he told us that it was the Foreign Office's intention that the British Council should be self-sustaining. Now, how close are you to that if we put the loan to one side? So we can come on to how and when it might be repaid, but let's say you succeed in rolling it over for the time being. Are you optimistic that you can balance the books?
Yeah, so I think it's important just to qualify what we mean by self-sustaining. So we will, the accounts you saw, we will lose money. And remember that I said 85% of the income we generate comes from outside the government, 15% from inside the government. And it's really our obligation, it's on us to make that 85% profitable. We understand that. And since COVID, we've made really substantial cuts to the British Council. We cut about £185 million out of our cost base. We focused in on the core areas of culture, education, and English, and set aside other things like justice that we worked on. We made all sorts of structural changes inside to make us more viable. Now, what's happened since then in that 85% is all of it is subject to some market volatility, because it might be the English teaching business, there's competition, it goes up and down. It might be the English exams business, which has competition. It's gone down significantly over the last couple of years just because of the reductions in immigration around the world. So the numbers there have fallen. And the other businesses we have too, where we raise a lot of money from corporates to do things, who support things. That just depends on the state of the economy, how much money they have, or the philanthropy we raise also depends on the state of the economy. That's all really gone against us over the last couple of years. It's a tough market out there, not only for the British Council, for everyone. So we have more work to do. And we're planning to take out of the British Council another significant chunk of costs, probably $250 million over the next 5 years. We need to do that to make the organization more viable. But I think underneath that, there's support we need from the government to make that possible and make sure we can continue to operate.
So your definition of self-sustaining is that the British Council will continue to receive perhaps around 15% of its budget from grant from the Foreign Office?
Yeah, self-sustaining to me would be that we have a solid and continuous amount that comes from the Foreign Office, and the rest we make financially viable and profitable, so that the UK gets essentially all of that for free as a soft power tool.
Some would think self-sustaining means that you are capable of standing around 2 feet without any subsidy, but you don't see that as any realistic possibility.
I don't see that any time in the future, but for a couple of reasons. One, financially, I don't see how it would happen immediately, but secondly, strategically, the thing that makes us effective as a soft power tool is that how connected we are to the government. So we work sort of hand in hand with the embassies, the high commissions around the world. We have a combined strategy with them for how we utilize soft power. And if we were I think what you're describing is sort of an independent NGO separate from government that funded itself. That might have value as an organization, but that's not what we're here to do.
Well, and actually, I think the British Council probably should be funded in part by the government, because I think you bring benefits. But if I could just return quickly to the matter of the loan. If you get to a position where you are, in your definition, self-sustaining, you still have this £200 million sitting there. Is there any immediate prospect of your being able to repay any of it, or do you anticipate simply it rolling over indefinitely?
I'll tell you what we've proposed here, although none of this is settled with the FCDO yet. So when we first took the loan, which was in the middle of COVID, it was £250 million. And the first thing we did was sell one of our really good businesses, which is the English assessment business in India, so we could pay back some of the money and show goodwill right away. So we sold that business, and we paid back $50 million of the loan right away and brought it down to 200. It sits now at 197, but let's call it 200 as we go through the discussion. And it rolls over year by year, which we can't possibly repay in the near term. So we have proposed that, I think as was always envisioned when we created this, a much longer term repayment plan, 20, 25 years, that we start repaying, say, 2, 3, 4 years from now. And in the meantime, we will sell more assets so that there are repayments up to that point. And then we come up with a reasonable settlement with reasonable terms and pay this off over a long period that's affordable. At the moment, the way it's structured, it's a high interest rate. It's pretty onerous. We pay £14 million a year in interest. Every year when we roll it over, there are a couple million in admin costs for rolling it over. And it doesn't seem like a good use of our money or time.
Can I take you over to Alex? Because I think you've got some questions on this too.
Thank you, Scott. Good to meet you again. Just sticking to the loans. So part of that cost was used for your transformation programme. So could you tell us a bit more about how successful that's been and how the loan contributed to progress there?
Yes. So when we were given the loan, there were really two purposes to it. One was just for solvency, because as you can imagine, our £850 million that comes from external sources went to close to zero for a time during COVID because there was no face-to-face business. And the other was to help us rebuild those businesses so we could become self-sustaining over time. And so we took that and we did a number of things. We focused in on the core areas of the British Council. We redesigned our global programs around the world where we generally had thousands of customized programs. We consolidated those into 16 global programs. We did this cost cutting I referred to earlier of about £185 million. That was 17% of the headcount of the British Council. It was 1,450 people. And 25% in many of the core areas of the British Council. So it wasn't an easy thing to do, and it did have impact on us. But I'm not trying to argue by this that something else should have happened. We knew we had to do that, and we did that. And the other thing we did that was quite radical, I think, for any part of government is that we outsourced all of our back office functions. So finance, HR, a lot of the IT functions to a third-party provider because we realized we can't continue to invest in the technology required to make those businesses efficient over time. So we've outsourced that, and we have the sort of value-added bits still in-house, and that is working over time. We closed 18 countries around the world that we were operating in. Took our presence out just because we couldn't afford to operate in them. And some of those we pulled out of completely, so we have no presence now, and some of them we kind of hubbed into other areas, so we're covering them from other countries. And that plan has been 90% successful. We did it, we're focused on getting it all right. The only bit that's dragging on a little bit is that outsourcing where we've realized that outsourcing of the finance functions for 100 complex countries is more complicated than we had originally thought.
Well, if I just ask a question, Alex? I mean, of the 200 million that you were lent, what proportion of that was used for restructuring?
So ultimately, all of it, because we just needed the money. No, that's not right. Probably half of it was used just to meet short-term cash obligations, and half of it would have been used for restructuring of those businesses afterwards.
It wouldn't be. So it wasn't more like 20 million.
No, it wasn't. It was roughly those numbers.
Right.
Thank you. So there's been lots of cost savings that have been generated by the transformation and the outsourcing. But your last set of accounts for the year ending March 23 said that there was material uncertainty over whether the British Council would be able to survive financially. How much of that is just around that ambiguity about the repayment of the loan, and how much of that is like the genuine survivability of the organisation?
It's a good question. I'll answer it in one sec because I missed something off my previous answer there, which was, as well as doing all that I described, we did also regrow the businesses enormously. So they have bounced back and they're growing, and the restructuring of them worked. So our English business is growing again. That is entirely based on the fact that technically that material uncertainty is that, yes, we've had a 1-year loan extension, but unless that is also extended next year, we would be insolvent next year. So we're living under this constant threat of insolvency because we only have 1 year's loan outstanding.
So it's just the loan, it's not the rest of the business that's causing that uncertainty?
No.
Thank you.
Before we move on to losses, can I just go just take us back to some of the financial results? Because there's the just looking at your annual net income and expenditure, and I'm using a source which is the Scrutiny Unit analysis of British Council accounts, and it does seem to boomerang quite considerably. I mean, historically, from what I understand, you kind of more or less, were even. The amount of money spent was about the amount of money that you got in, and everything, and it fluctuated a little bit, but not hugely. -9 in 16-17, plus 5 million 17-18, plus 30 18-19, and then minus 7.5 19-20. But then in 2021, you're 90.8 million in the red, and then the next year you're 80.5 million in the black, and then in 22-23 you're 53 million in the red again, which is really something. And I just wondered how that had come about. It must be very difficult. I mean, just looking at that, it looks chaotic. I just wondered what was happening here.
I think all you're seeing there, that's not reflective of the underlying profit or surplus of the business, which was very strong, growing consistently until COVID, and then very negative for a couple of years, now has been consistently growing.
Well, no, 22-23, according to this, I don't know if is your 53.8 in the red, 22-23.
What you'll be picking up there is the way we do our accounts, the investment we make gets counted as an expense. So the investment in the restructuring, as we sort of rebuild these businesses, will end up looking like we're losing money that year. Well, we are on a cash basis, but that's why the profit numbers bounce around.
And so this is why you're continuing to need to borrow more money after post-COVID.
So after COVID, we're not borrowing any extra money. It's the same loan outstanding that we have. The issue is just we are not unable to pay it back immediately. But we only drew down the end of that loan a year ago. That, whether in government or in the private sector, no one would have expected us to be able to repay that loan a year after drawing down what was essentially an emergency loan.
No, I understand that. But I suppose I'm thinking, that if we're talking about the loan and the importance of the loan being triggered largely because of COVID, then 22-23 were outside of COVID. Your 53.88 according to your annual profit and loss. You're 53 million pounds in the red post COVID, and that's what I didn't understand.
Okay, so what's happening there is we're, in COVID, if you think the businesses went down to maybe 50% of the volume they were generating, and as we come out of COVID, they are growing again. And they're growing, as you can see from those numbers, pretty significantly each year, 10 or 20% a year. But they've got to catch up to make us profitable again. So we've cut...
I'm so sorry. I know it's me. But 21-22, you've got a net profit of £82.55 million. And then the next year, 22-23, you're in the red of £53 million.
So I will have to take a look at the specific numbers you're citing, because the up number you have doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, we lost money in COVID, and we've been slowly making more money as we come out. So you're positive 80, I don't understand, and we'll have to have a look at that.
It may be that the loan is being reflected in some of those numbers and not in others. So we can go away and do a note on it.
Can I just ask, you referred to the fact that the reference to material uncertainty over the future of the British Council is because of the loan, and each year you have to go to the Foreign Office and get agreement, which you only get at the last minute. And that cannot be a satisfactory situation. Would it not be much better for the Foreign Office to agree with you that this loan is going to have to be repaid over a much longer period, agree a plan for doing so, and then extending it not to the end of the next financial year, but for the next, say, 10 or 15 years?
Yes, that's exactly what we have proposed as well, and that is what they are considering now.
And are considering that.
But when you had the original agreement with Dominic Raab, presumably you had some detail in it. It isn't just we're going to give you £200 million. It was like how you were going to pay it back and when you were going to pay it back. You didn't just leave the room with an agreement for £200 million.
So the agreement at the time was, we'll give you this $200 million for these purposes. This is an emergency now. Go away and fix the British Council, and in time we will agree what the future repayment plan is.
And you said earlier that the future repayment plan, as far as you were concerned, was selling off more assets.
No, it was always going to, in our minds, it was always going to be a combination of a longer-term repayment plan. So
the money doesn't matter how long the money takes. Where are you going to get the money from? If it's right that despite the £82 million, which keeps looking at me, profit, and the 90 million in the red the year before, but if generally you're bumping along, paying out as much as you're getting in roughly, how are you going to pay back the 200 million?
So before COVID, we actually made money every year, and we used that money at the time to subsidize the rest of the British Council. So when we made money in the English teaching businesses, we just did more programs in culture and education, in the pursuit of soft power. And we do expect, these cuts, the future cuts I described we will make. We're designing the British Council to generate a surplus again. And we'll hopefully use that surplus to do a combination of pay back the loan, build up reserves, and continue to invest in the British Council.
And the surpluses...
Go ahead.
The surpluses were subsidising the decline in the grant in the non-ODA network in particular. So in Europe, for example, and across the Gulf, where our numbers were going down significantly in terms of the grant that we were getting from the FCDO. So we were using our surpluses to effectively prop up the work across Europe, which obviously now we're not able to do because we don't have a surplus coming in. So we are seeing on the ground much less resource in places that we really need it.
Into the future, you're going to use the money that you make on things like teaching to pay back the 200 million so long as the Foreign Office agrees and gives you sufficient amount of time to pay it back. And how much do you think how long would you need to be able to pay it back? Yeah.
So our proposal to the Foreign Office has been 20 to 25 years because we would like to have a balance. Like if we get that business in surplus again, we'd like to have a balance between paying back the loan, continuing to invest in British Council activity, and building up reserves so that if this ever happens again, something like COVID, we will have more reserves to be able to withstand it.
Bill, you had a question?
I think, Kate, you alluded to this. Hopefully you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about what the impact is, especially in places like Europe, of the cut in the non-ODA spend in the accounts. And then secondly, very pointedly, we talked a lot about the loan. To what extent are the terms of the loan, without going into specifics, comparable to other arm's length bodies? My understanding is that it's quite considerable, the burden that the loan places on the council, and we've heard some of that testimony. But it'd be useful to dig into that a little bit.
Well, I'll answer your loan question, and maybe you come back on the non-ODA in Europe. The terms of that loan are on what I would say are purely commercial terms, as if we were not a government entity in any way, and based on our credit rating, which, as you can tell, from what I have said so far, is not good. So they are, the way they price loans is off a base rate, which they use SONIA these days. Ours is SONIA plus 2%. And so those are far worse terms than all of the other ALBs that we have seen and seen their loan terms during COVID.
Why is that?
I think it was because when you're giving a loan to an ALB, you need to decide how much of it you should think of as pure commercial and how much you think of as supporting government objectives. We've always argued that everything the British Council does is for government. We don't have shareholders. We don't pay people a lot of money. So that anything we earn is to support the government. But the FCDO's view has been that there's a portion of the British Council which is a commercial entity, so it needs to compete in the open market with other commercial firms, and it can't be given subsidies to help it do that. so that the loan had to be purely commercial.
Before we move off, can I ask just a couple of other questions? Is it right that your art collection is roughly the equivalent of your loan, the amount of loan?
Yes, that is right. We have an art collection that's worth about £200 million. So you're accurate about that. It's a collection we've gathered over about 90 years through mainly donations, bequests. Most of the artists we've worked with have given us art. And it's all there to support future UK artists, and we take that art around the world and show off UK artists and what we can create here.
At any time, how much of it is in storage?
A fair bit is in storage, so we've probably got 20% moving around the world. We have 9,000 pieces, so it's a big collection. There's too much in storage. We're always looking for other ways to move more of it around.
There's one way to sell some of it.
Yes, let me come to that because there's some important background bits. About 50% of the collection is restricted. We can never sell it because when we took it, we promised we would hold it into perpetuity for the UK. And selling any of it would breach sort of the Museum Association Code of Ethics, which we're part of. It would alienate the cultural industry. It would alienate the philanthropists who give us money to support the industry. But we are looking at the bits we could sell to see whether we need to sell them to bring down part of the loan. So that's one of the assets.
On the restricted artwork, was it the government that signed up to not selling it? Was it the...
No, it would have been us.
It was the Arts Council.
Yeah.
So it was given to the Arts Council.
No, it's given to the British Council.
Given to the British... British Council.
British Council. That would be, you'd have a famous painter give us a painting, but say, I'm not giving this to you to sell. You're holding this for the UK, and I'm giving it to you to support artists, not to sell and make money. So 50% has that. So 50% doesn't. Now, one of the things that we proposed through our long discussions on this is there a way of taking part of the British Council art collection and moving it to the government collection and having some loan relief through that? Because then it would stay in government hands, it would still be supporting UK art. But there hasn't been a lot of interest in that because of the obvious financial challenges of the government at the moment.
But 80% of it's in storage anyway. I mean, if half of it is not restricted, instead of it being handed over to the government in exchange for paying off the loan, can't you just sell it?
We could sell it, and that the 50% that is not restricted, we are exploring what we can sell. In fact, it's a good point. Everything the British Council has, which isn't that much anymore, we are exploring selling. We have 40 buildings left around the world, which are worth about £126 million. Again, about half of those we can't sell because they've been given to us by other countries and with the expectation we wouldn't sell them, but some of it we could. We have the art collection, and we could sell some of that, and there are a few other discrete assets we could sell. And from our perspective, it's not a great place to be in, but the British Council is, we're in financial peril at the moment, so we are looking at selling all of that.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to the losses, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think we want to do the Europe question. I'll come back to that.
Do you have time?
Oh, of course, yes, go on. Yes.
No. So your question was about what we're doing in Europe and what our ambitions are for Europe. So obviously, it's a big part of this government's agenda, and I think we really welcome those efforts because our bilateral relationships with the 27 member states where we have offices has been really important post-Brexit, post the departure from Erasmus and also Creative Europe. And we have seen a real decline in the numbers of students coming to the UK from Europe, but also in the number of the partnerships between creative institutions as well. So one of the things that we know countries want, and particularly young people in those countries want, is mobility. So we would have a plan to grow the mobility of both students and professionals across Europe and the UK. We would want to run a big programme of major grants to address the challenges faced by the loss of Creative Europe, for example. But we would also want to work with the eastern part of Europe, where obviously we're seeing the issues around disinformation for young people are very, very kind of real at the moment. We've had a very, very successful program running in the Baltic states, the 21st Century Skills program that was funded by FCDO, which is essentially giving young people in schools right across those countries the skills to understand disinformation and to fight it. We would like to do much more of that work. And then we would like to also look at, this issue around European security, and looking at working with young people in Poland and in the countries surrounding Ukraine during the war. We've done a lot of work with displaced young people and with teachers to teach through resilience. So at the moment, we only spend about £8.5 million programme across 27 countries. We think that is not enough, and we will be pitching within the CSR for an uplift and non-ODA grant in order to reach some of those ambitions.
Thank you very much. That's an important answer. And it's actually Richard wants to do a follow-up. We're going to have to move on quickly.
And I appreciate those are examples, but what makes you suppose that there is demand in those places for those sorts of things? Just one thing that made me question it is there's actually very good disinformation training and education in Nordic and Baltic states. They're very far advanced in this area. In fact, don't you think that perhaps the UK could learn from some of the education over there on disinformation?
I think in all our relationships, in whatever country that we're in, mutuality is at the very heart of it. So yes, there's always a mutual learning going on. I think we've seen in the Baltic states the continuation of wanting to evolve that thinking, and they've really welcomed the Britain's input into that. But as I said, there's many other countries across the Western Balkans as well, for example, where this kind of work is really important and less developed. So it's always about, taking the lessons learned and, putting them into new countries as well. But I think we feel that there's a huge demand, for this type of work, and innovating it with digital means and sources as well, that obviously young people need.
Afra.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask some questions around some of the losses that were recorded in the accounts. So looking at the 2022-23 accounts, they show the British Council recorded 356 instances of losses, so where money was lost with no benefit to the organisation. And these losses resulted in 2.6 million being wasted in 2022-23. It looks like the largest of these was a £1 million loan in China, which was written off. Can you provide a bit of detail about what happened there?
Yeah, so you're probably covering two categories of things there, bad debt and fraud.
Well, this is, specifically kind of looking at the losses, but I do want to come on to talking about some of the fraud as well, separately. Are you able to kind of clarify on? I'll let you kind of expand, and then I can chip in on the two bits.
I'll leave fraud aside, and maybe we'll come back to that. So we have, because we're running a large commercial business that is the size of a FTSE business around the world. We have lots of relationships with partners. Those might be venues, they might be people doing exams for us. We might have a franchising arrangement for people to do teaching for us, and a whole variety of other things. And so in a portfolio of nearly £1 billion business, you would expect a significant element of bad debts in that, and it's your job over time to manage it, and you wouldn't expect to eliminate it. And generally what will happen to us is the biggest case where we have write-offs is we will have a partner, for instance, that is the venue where we're doing exams. It's really a joint venture with them, so they provide the venue, they provide the people, we're providing the English expertise and the exams coming through IELTS. And we'll work with them over a number of years, but some of them occasionally go bankrupt or go under, and we have procedures in place to try and prevent and minimize that. Now, there are a couple examples I do know. The China example I don't know, so we will have to get back to you on that.
It's £1 million. You ought to know. I'm sorry, but you should know, shouldn't you?
No, I should know £1 million. I just don't know that one.
Okay, well, I mean, it would be helpful to come back to that, and I think also to understand, obviously, we've talked about why the accounts for the 24 financial year haven't been published yet, but do you anticipate that losses to be of a similar level, or just to kind of understand whether that's something that's being managed over time, and particularly where these are, potentially businesses going insolvent, whether the contracts that you're using are kind of robust enough to try to minimise the impact for the British Council when those instances happen?
Yeah, so it's something very high on our priority list. I think we've got good processes around it, and I think by any sort of benchmark compared to other businesses, we do pretty well. I would also mention just any of the money that's being lost there is lost on the commercial or 85% side of our business. Again, that doesn't cost the UK taxpayer a penny. That's something that's sustained by the British Council. But I think what you're getting at is, do we feel we have strong processes? Yes. Do we feel we minimize the losses? Yes. Will we still have some over time? Yes.
Thank you. And just kind of to focus on the fraud aspect, which we touched on, again, looking at the 2022-23 accounts as the latest that we've been able to see, the accounts do state that the British Council continues to make progress in detecting fraud across all the areas of its operation, as well as improving the counter-fraud culture and helping to keep further fraud to an absolute minimum. The fraud report for that year lists 126 cases of fraud in a single year, which seems quite substantial. And I guess just wanted to ask, you're talking about keeping fraud to an absolute minimum. Do you feel that you're achieving that?
Let me just read a quote to you from the UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact on our fraud team, where they say the British Council has robust fraud measurement systems, a strong organizational culture that prioritizes transparency and accountability, and high standards in fraud management compared with other organizations. So the answer to your question is yes. I think we've got a good culture and good processes around there. And I think the numbers you cite, they do feel high unless you're running a business in some ways that's a consumer business. We have millions of interactions with consumers every year. And someone trying to cheat on an exam is an example of fraud. Or the millions of people we're dealing with trying to get an advantage is an example of fraud. And that's why the numbers, why 100 and something seems high, but actually in the scheme of millions of touch points, I don't think it is very high.
I mean, compared to our income, I think we estimate in 2023-24 that it would be 0.02% of our income. Now, any percentage is too much, but that is quite low. If you think about the volumes of the IELTS exams around the world in some really challenging environments where the fraud culture is high, essentially.
I mean, I think what's interesting as well is what the trend is showing. And obviously, again, we haven't seen the latest set of accounts. Do you expect instances of fraud to go up or down or remain relatively the same?
So what we'd like to see is over time in all of the things, like whether it's fraud or safeguarding or other things, we kind of like to see the number of instances reported go up to show that our systems are working well and the amount to go down. What we've been seeing in fraud overall is for the last several years, it's been relatively consistent. It costs us about £150,000 every year, and it's about 100 and change cases each year. So it's been consistent. We have a really good team that comes from outside of government. So they're sort of ex-police or similar things, and they've really instituted what I'd say is a good fraud culture across the organization. Every single one of us, all 9,500 people at the British Council, have to do fraud training every year.
Okay, so just
do you mind if I just clarify something? Which you were talking about I think in answer to the questions about the 126 cases of fraud, and you said, of course, exam fraud is a type of fraud, but that's not. Are you including those in the 126?
Yeah, all sort of cases of fraud that result in some number there would be there.
The financial fraud, the 126, is that financial fraud purely, or does that include people cheating in their exams?
It also includes exams in there.
Is it distinguished anywhere when you're?
Yeah, I don't have the breakdown numbers here, but I can provide them. I think we've got pretty detailed measures on that.
Thank you.
The types of fraud we have would be, we'd find some in procurement, where people are trying to cheat us or working with our own people to cheat us on things. Expenses, where people are trying to overinflate their expenses. And exams is quite unique to us, where the fraud around cheating and just the intent. One of the hard things in exams is whether it's on paper or online, you've got to keep the exam secret, and at the same time, have millions of people write it, and there's lots of organized crime that tries to actually access those exams.
Oh, yeah.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think understanding that you're saying that it seems to be fairly consistent over time, are there any things that you think the council could be doing further to reduce fraud and try and get that to be a downward trend?
Yes. I asked our fraud team just for his preparation to this, how comfortable are they? And their answer was, we're comfortable, we're doing many good things, but we're not complacent. And the fraudsters seem to innovate at a pretty fast pace. So we continue to invest, we continue to try and have more digital solutions to address fraud, and we continue to increase the training.
I think the training and preparation of staff is really, really important. If you think about the environments that we work in all over the world, it's really important that our country directors and other teams really have their eye out for everything, are reporting things in, or investigating, but that they have the support of this specialist team in the centre who really know what they're doing. And I've worked overseas for many years in the British Council, and having that really professional central expertise is really critical. So obviously we could do with more of it, to be honest. Our resources are tight. So therefore, those types of central teams we have to keep quite small, but I would say it's a really essential part of our kind of tool armoury.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Afra. Richard's got some more questions about staffing, actually.
Yeah, I'd like to think a little bit about numbers and proportions of staff. I think if we take the 5-year period around COVID, say between 2018 and 2023, I understand that the British Council employed 30% fewer teachers at the end of that period than at the beginning. And I wonder what are the reasons for that, please?
Yeah, so one number I mentioned before was between right before COVID and now. So we've done a reduction of the British Council by 17% heads, and we did that in targeted areas where we were either unprofitable or we simply just didn't have enough money to fund the things we were trying to do. One of them was teaching. One of our challenges has been we've taught English now for close to the 90 years we've been around, and we think it's an important part of soft power. We think it's an important part of what the British Council does, and we don't only do it to generate income. We do it because it does build trust and build affinity with the UK around the world, we believe. But the teaching business hasn't been profitable for a long time for us. So when we got into trouble in COVID, one of the decisions we took is one of the places where we cut quite deeply was in teaching, to try and make it back to at least break even for us. So that's why you would find big numbers there.
And over the same period, the number of senior managers recruited by the British Council increased by 22%. What were the senior managers being recruited to do, and how has that changed the nature of the British Council's business?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we did have to change business model. When we cut significantly during that period, we had to look at what was our role and our function. And I think the simplest way to think of it is, often when we'd done programs before, we did everything from the conceptual design, the organization, the networking to bring people together, and then the delivery of that program on the ground with lots of hands running around, setting up events and things like that. And we had to make a decision. We can't afford to do all that anymore. So which are the highest value pieces for the UK? And we thought the highest value pieces were sort of the design of the program, the organization, and then a lot of the running, the more junior work, could be done by others. And so you saw a shift towards more senior people who were doing those first pieces I described, and we reduced some of the junior people actually executing the programs.
A lot of the junior people were sort of generalists. They wouldn't have had specific arts or educational English backgrounds, but they were incredibly good at, as Scott says, sort of doing the stuff. So we invested in more specialist roles as part of that senior cadre too.
And how did that change the output, what it was that the British Council was producing, as it were?
In the end, we were producing something similar, which was, it might be a program to help young girls in the north of Africa with digital fluency and English fluency. But it's a question of how were we doing it, and how much did it cost to do, and which parts did we choose to do ourselves. And I think all organizations do this over time. You sort of gravitate towards the bits in the value chain which you think you do best and have added value for us. So that's essentially what we did there. And we said the actual execution of it, maybe we don't have value anymore doing that on the ground, but we still have enormous value in designing it, organizing it, pulling all the partners together.
Okay, thanks. Until 2019, you published an annual gender pay gap, and then I don't think that was being published since. Why did you stop publishing the gender pay gap at that point?
Well, I think you've just missed it. We've continued to publish it. So I'll tell you the most recent numbers. So the most recent one we published was in 22-23, and our average pay gap fell from 16% to 15%. And there's three things that are really important about that gender pay gap. The first is that none of that is driven by sort of in UK law, unequal pay. We pay men and women the same at each different level. So it's driven by two things, and one vastly outweighs the other. The first is that in the top half of our people we have paid, 49% of them are women. So it's a slight imbalance. There's slightly more men to women, but marginally. And so we have a number of initiatives, in place to get that up to 50-50, and that will close a tiny portion of the pay gap. The biggest portion of the pay gap is driven by the fact that in the lower half of our pay group, 65% of that group are women. And we seem to attract, I think it's a type of occupational segregation. We have lots of jobs that appeal to women, both in the UK and around the world, although that doesn't come into the UK pay gap. It's much harder to address because you either try and remove the women from the bottom half, or you end up promoting them all through and you have 65% women right up to the top. So it takes longer to address.
It seems to have been going in the wrong direction. I wondered how you would account for the gender pay gap having doubled over that 5-year period.
And isn't the point that although you publish the pay gap, you don't publish the detailed analysis explaining why so you used to publish a detailed analysis until 2019, and although you continue to publish the gap, and obviously you have to, you're not giving the sort of the analysis that you did have until then, and that coincides with the gap having got bigger. I think that's the point, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing which we don't understand. Yeah.
So I guess 2 points is I don't think what you said though is right. I mean, our pay gap is going down over time.
I think the statistics I'm looking at is from 17-18, it was 10.9%. In 23-24, it was 20.7%.
Okay. And Chair, I'm sure you're right on whether we publish the detail or not. I'm not sure why we've stopped publishing the detail. Certainly we have
I think
nothing
given
to
that
hide
it
there.
coincides with the pay gap getting worse, it might be a good idea to go back to doing it again. So that we can just look at why it's happening.
Because the reasons are really clear. I mean, we're a really brilliant employer of women around the world. So many of the environments that we work in, where other professions are quite difficult for women, women tell us that they feel extremely safe in those environments. So, changing that would be really difficult because we don't want to stop attracting some of those brilliant women. But we do have equity now at our senior levels, and that has been a really important shift for the organisation.
I wondered though if you could have a think about Richard's questions, because I think they're really important. That Because if we're right that you're no longer publishing the detailed analysis
absolutely.
and that coincides with the pay gap getting worse, then I think before you can do anything about it, you need to understand what's happened. And if Richard's questions can prompt you into having a think about that and writing to us, we'd appreciate it. Is that right, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, I wondered whether you have information on pay gap in relation to diversity.
Yeah, we have an ethnicity pay gap at the moment of the average pay gap is 14.6. I mean, again, that is to do with having more black and ethnic minority staff at more junior levels. We have, however, seen good progress in promotions, and we have a number of active programmes that are working, particularly in the UK, with our ethnic and minority colleagues to provide them with opportunity in more leadership positions. Bearing in mind that these stats are to do with the UK only. Obviously, as a global organisation, the vast majority of our staff are nationally appointed. So in sub-Saharan Africa, about 98% of our staff are African. So therefore, these stats are about quite a small number of people, but we have got some targeted intervention through our anti-racism plan, which looks at the UK, but also globally, and the UK is very much about representation at more senior levels.
Blair, I think you've got some questions on measuring soft power.
Yes. I'm very struck, Mr. McDonald, you opened a very big picture talking about this global battle that's taking place, and it's obviously the context you're operating in, where there's this military, economic, ideological, cultural struggle going on between countries, and yet our conversation today is about taking hundreds of millions of pounds of cost out, to disposing of assets, talking about flogging the artwork and things like that. I wonder whether you feel at times you're being sent into that battle unarmed, given how much investment you get from the government.
Thank you. I couldn't have put it better myself. We get £165 million from the government every year. And I want to put this into context so let's just think about some other countries that are close by and probably have similar objectives to us. So Germany puts equivalently about £900 million into the same thing. Mm-hmm. That's the combination of the Goethe Institute and DAAD, so culture and education. We do both. France puts £600 million in. Spain puts £900 million in. Japan puts £600 million in. The Chinese...
wait for a moment.
Chinese, we think, probably put more like £10 billion in. So we're fighting with the smallest amount by far of any developed country. Even a relatively small country like Portugal, we estimate, puts in £250 million into the equivalent of the British Council. Now, over time, we've been able to address that because we generate so much ourselves. And if you go out in the world and ask about who is the most effective soft power organization in the world, every single person in the world will tell you it's the British Council. But that's because 85% of what we're doing, we're generating ourselves from other sources in the government. So for that 165, it looks like there's $1 billion out there in action around the world. And so what we're really seeking as we go ahead into this next spending review is we do need an increase in that core grant so that we can continue operating in the places and doing the things we want to do. But we also want the FCDO to work with us to understand that 85% is volatile, and that as it bounces around over time, which it will, and I don't think it's because it's badly run, it's just these are volatile markets. You've got a real business there that you're running. We don't want to have to keep shutting down a whole bunch of the British Council because our English teaching business slowed, and then we get more money and we build up some of the British Council, then we shut it down. So I'd love to have ultimately some sharing arrangement with the government where we could say, like, here's the amount we invest in our main soft power asset. But if you have a bad year in the rest of the money you're trying to generate, that might be a bit more. And if you have a really good year, that might be a bit less.
Can I ask a bit? I mean, when you did the comparison with sort of competitor nations and also sort of friendly nations and less friendly nations within that list, you defined that in terms of the inputs that the governments are putting in. how do you measure the sort of comparative success on outputs? So I'm kind of interested in for the 46 times as much that the Chinese government are investing in their soft power apparatus, what are they delivering in terms of outcomes that we are not able to deliver at the moment?
So the best things we have to measure the entirety of it, I think, are the soft, at least at the moment, the various soft power surveys that come out, whether that's Brand Finance or the UK government's own surveys to say, what is the attractiveness of the UK as a country and how has culture and other things affected that. And the UK over time has consistently been very high. And I think some of that has been because of the British Council, because we've been out there and being very effective. And we've generally been number one or number two in those studies compared to all those countries who invest far more. But recently, in recent years, that is coming under pressure, and we've been starting to slip. And we've been starting to slip particularly in those middle ground global south countries who have some options on which countries they want to look to and work with. And I think part of that is driven by the investment of some of our challengers out there in the world.
I mean, what the Chinese don't have is English.
Yes.
And I mean, English is one of the biggest soft power tools that we can have. And our other competitors also don't have English. But they do have a lot of presence. They have a lot of offices. I mean, the Confucius centres have grown enormously. Yeah. So one of the metrics used to look at soft power indices is sort of representation in countries, numbers of places that have Confucius institutes, etc.
Sorry, can I? Because I'm having some difficulty understanding this. I hope I'm representative of others who might be having this too. So I think Blair's question is like, if the Chinese are spending so much more money and they're being more effective in, let's say, Southern Africa, what would you get from that money if I was in Africa in Zambia or something? What would I be getting from the Chinese that would be different?
I think what you'd get. So the Chinese model, I think you all know very well, is quite different than ours in that it's like a fully integrated model. So when they come to a country, there's sort of I'm not the designer behind this, so I may not have it 100% correct, but it's a much more integrated approach to here's the economic support for the country, we'll build roads and ports. Here's the cultural support, here's the language support, here's the huge scholarship program we have for your students to come and study in China and learn about China. And it's a very integrated approach. Ours, I'd say, is also coordinated, but what you get if you're one of those countries is you do get interest, you get support, you get best practice on how to develop regulation, you get views on values, you get money, you get scholarships for all your students to go and study. And what does China get, or what do we get? It's the flip side of that. It's that we have more people visiting, generating tourism revenue. We have more people studying here, generating revenue there. We have many more people trading with us when there are big global problems in the world, whether we're looking for votes at the UN or whether we're simply looking for alliances and support, you're more likely to get that. I think that's the two sides.
Can I just finally? I mean, you mentioned the advantage we have with language. We've also got the BBC. We've got our cultural outputs, our rule of law, our historical ties with a lot of these countries as well. Do all of those advantages? Do you think that makes us complacent? Is that why we are not as aggressively investing in this as other countries? Do we assume that those advantages will just continue in perpetuity without that investment?
There is an element of that. I mean, English does give us a huge advantage, I think, and we've used it well over time. And the British Council has, I mentioned before, we're working in 50 countries right now helping design, not just teaching people, but design the whole education system. So I was in, let me give you a specific example to try and bring it alive. I was in Colombia this year. And Colombia is sort of at that spot in the world where they need to decide where to lean. They could lean east, they could lean north, they could lean somewhere else. And we are working in the three big cities there developing the public school systems to become bilingual in Spanish and English. If we weren't there doing that, they might become bilingual in something else. And if they do that, it's always the frustrating thing about working in soft power is actually finally getting to the metric. Hopefully, as you go through your inquiry in the years ahead, we'll get closer there. But I'm pretty certain that them speaking English rather than another language will increase trade with us.
And we would really welcome the Soft Power Council that obviously is being launched on Wednesday. But that does need investment, because as you say, the UK has some incredible soft power assets that are still at the very forefront of what people find attractive in our country. And we know from the research that we do a global survey every other year into what young people think of the UK around in the G20 countries. And that tells us, over and over and over again that the most important assets, as you say, are education, creativity in the arts, but also things like open democracies, etc. And you can't be complacent. We did see a little dip over time because during the sort of, I'd say the 1920, 2021 period, when there was a little bit in the dip in the UK's attractiveness, but actually it's gone back up again. But we can't be complacent.
You talked about the British Council's programme and specifically referred to the EU and the Baltic nations. I visited the British Council office in Latvia, and they talked about their programme of, I think, 40 projects that they're supporting, some of which are, just to give you an example from their website, to develop socially creative and inclusive arts and culture platforms and promote a mutually respectful dialogue between different groups and communities based on shared experience. I mean, that's a very worthy project, but why is the British taxpayer paying for it? Because Latvia is a developed European nation, and this is an internal project to support communities within Latvia, but I'm not quite sure why the British Council should be doing it.
Part of the underlying rationale between a lot of those programs is to support community cohesion and their ability to understand information, disinformation, make informed choices, be able to have a strong view on the future of the country and the direction they choose. I mean, Latvia is developed, as you say, but it is also at the front line between us and Russia. And the young people and communities in Latvia, I think, need a communication conduit to the UK and UK people, and they need to be reminded of what our case is for democracy and free speech and all the things we believe in. And I think
in countries where democracy is well established, and I don't want to specifically talk about Latvia, but particularly member states of the EU, which share Western values, have democratic governments, are reasonably well resourced. I'm not quite sure why that should be a priority for us, whereas there are plenty of countries that don't have that, which perhaps might appreciate it or might be more valuable.
I agree, and I'd say so. If you take let's take France, for instance. We're not in France trying to build community cohesion or talk about disinformation. In France, we're trying to connect the UK culture industry to the French culture industry to generate business and generate growth. That's what we're trying to do. Or the same in education, or possibly the same in young people having communication, across countries so that they will come up with interesting ideas for innovation or growth in the future. So we do swing the balance of what we're trying to do, and France looks very different than what we're doing in Nigeria or Indonesia, for instance.
And what they are interested in is collaboration at the higher education sector as well. So scientific collaboration and different educational collaboration at higher education is still of huge interest to European governments, and we can provide that kind of brokering role in that.
Trying to encourage students to come to British universities and to foster collaboration, I think is perfectly worthy. It's where there are projects which aren't specifically related to the UK, where you're spending money at a time when you're under huge financial pressure, and I just wonder whether some of the areas actually you couldn't step aside and say, well, this isn't really in our interest, we'll leave it to the governments concerned.
I think it's a fair point, and there's a constant evolution of the programs we do, and a constant, we're accountable to the FCDO and to you and ultimately to the taxpayer to make sure we can justify why those programs are adding value to the UK in one way or another. It might be directly growth, or it might be things we're doing in far-flung, dangerous regions of a country where we think we can turn people against extremism towards employment to cause us less problems in another way. But we're always testing whether we can justify those programs or not. And I think you're right, sometimes over time a country evolves and we no longer need to do certain things there, or the programs evolve.
Good. I've just got one further question, but if anyone else has another one, due to my brilliant chairing, we're finishing early, which is, what do you think? I mean, if you were able to, well, actually, I've got two questions. The first question is, what else do you think you should be doing if you were allowed to do anything else? If you were to start a new project, perhaps in a new area or what do you think? What would you like to do that you're not doing at the moment?
So the three biggest things which we think we're in the right headline areas, we think we have the right purpose, and the sort of theory of change we have is good. There are three big areas we think we can help the government agenda. The first is on re-engaging and rebuilding with Europe. Mm-hmm. Our connections in Europe have remained incredibly strong through the last 10 years. We're one of the only pillar-assessed organizations one of the only pillar-assessed UK organizations, which means we can engage in fora that others can't, and we can get funded by the EU. So some of the projects the British Council does around the world are funded by the EU. And that means, though, we have still very strong connections across Europe, and there's a lot we can do, particularly to help generate growth. And so we would like to do that. That's sort of the first plank. The second plank is we think our relationships in the global south and middle ground are as strong as anyone's. They're historical, they're very, very trusting. And as we try and develop stronger relationships with those countries in the way the FCDO talks about in a new, modern, mutually beneficial way, we think we can really be a linchpin of that, and again, to help drive growth in places. And then the third thing is the whole area of security, peace, and particularly disinformation. We think we've got a big role to play in all of the sort of fault line states, but in many of the spots around the world. And we haven't talked about it much today, but we can operate in many of the spots the UK government struggles to be effective. Venezuela, Myanmar, Cuba, Yemen, Iraq, I could go on and on. But because of sort of the personality of the British Council, we're in there. We continue to have people-to-people connections and a conduit for dialogue. And so those are the three things we would like to amp up and do more. But we do, at the moment, we haven't really been able to get across today just how stretched we are. This 165 million we have, and we recognize everyone is stretched these days, but we're sort of threadbare through the world. And that combined with the pressure we have on the 85%, I've really been trying to get across the FCDO that there is real financial peril here. It isn't just us moaning for more money. If we don't get the loan right, and that 85% declines at all, it is possible that the British Council isn't here in a year or two. And I'm not just trying to defend it from disappearing, but I think it would be an enormous blow to the UK. It would be a retreat. It would be a massive win for Putin's Russia if the British Council disappeared.
Yes, Jean.
One last quick question, which is a personal one, because when I was in government, I was responsible, along with my colleagues, in the establishment of the Cultural Protection Fund, which is something we were extremely proud of and which the British Council administers. I think it does a very important job, but given the financial constraints you're under, can you just say a word about the current state and its prospects?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic program, and the Cultural Protection Fund basically takes the UK's expertise in how to protect heritage. Sometimes that's physical, sometimes it's not physical, from the ravages of war or climate. And it's a wonderful relationship builder with countries around the world, and we operate things in the Middle East and in South Asia. Really, really interesting projects. Probably the most relevant example right now is Ukraine, where we're working on several initiatives, sites, whether those are protecting old buildings or archives or things like that, so that hopefully after the war they will still exist, and Ukraine can benefit from those. It has been a sort of funded by DCMS as it was when you set it up. It runs at about £10 million a year. I think it has one more year to run currently, and we're currently in discussions with DCMS to see what the future of it is.
I think we've just had confirmation of the rollover for the next year at the same level. But basically, to date, it's been £50 million in 19 countries and 159 projects, all of very, very high quality. We think it's an incredibly important part of our soft power assets, particularly as the world becomes more dangerous and more destroyed. We know that culture and heritage are at the heart of the country's reconstruction, whether that's its music or its buildings or its museums, it's a really, really important. We'll be pushing hard for the settlement for the following 3 years.
It was mentioned towards the start of the session that the British Council had exited a number of countries due to not being able to afford to continue. Are you able to share which countries those are, but also how that determination is made, and to what extent you consult and discuss proposals to exit from countries with the FCDO prior to that taking place?
Yeah, so let me talk just a bit about geographic prioritization for us, so that we do that prioritization based on several things. One is what the government cares about, what are their foreign policy objectives, where do they think the most important countries are. Also what the sectors care about, where does the arts and culture sector want to do business, so who do they want to work with and have us on the ground helping them. Same with the education sector. And then finally, I should mention, the 4 nations of the UK. A lot of what we're talking about here is devolved, and they have their own views. So Scotland has their own, education strategy, as does Wales and Northern Ireland. They have similar things in culture. So we take those into account, and then we take a view of, can we be effective in these countries? Do we have the relationships? Are we able to operate? And we take all that to come up with a geographic prioritization, and then work very closely with the FCDO on that. So when we closed the countries, we were in a state of real financial weakness then, and so the FCDO had more input than they would perhaps normally have, because they were calling a lot of the shots at that point. So where we closed was in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Malta, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, South Sudan, Switzerland, United States, Uruguay. And we hubbed, so we tried to keep presences, but we took the people off the ground in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Malta, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Slovakia, and Switzerland.
And over what period of time are those closures you just mentioned?
So that was all after COVID. So we did that sort of in a one shot a couple of years ago.
It took about 18 months. Yeah.
I mean, one of the challenges we have right now is, as long with everyone else in the government, we're putting in a pretty strong pitch for the spending review along the lines we've talked about, and we're asking for that 165 million. We're asking for an extra 75 million. And we think if we don't get any of that, we don't get any support on the loan, we're going to have to look at closing a lot more countries, probably more like 30 or 40 countries. And we're working through now what economically that means for us. But we're really hoping we get to an answer with the FCDO and we can prevent that, because I think it would be disastrous for the UK.
Yeah.
When we had the BBC World Service in front of us, they had a very specific example of where they had withdrawn from a particular bandwidth with their Arabic service, and the vacuum had been filled by Russian state broadcasters. You mentioned earlier a kind of hypothetical of, if we were not in Colombia, would they be bilingual in another language? within those countries you've listed there, are there specific examples you can think of where the vacuum has been filled by another nations?
So I think probably all the countries that are along the border to Russia there, we've lost some ground. But a few other things happen when we withdraw too, because you think initially we might save money as the UK, but then almost immediately the embassy realizes we need culture on the ground, we need education on the ground, so we'll have to put them into the embassy now. And they end up just hiring people in the embassies, but they don't have the same network to plug into as they would at the British Council. So I think it ends up being quite a bad deal for all of us.
And I mean, people really care on the ground. And when I say people, I mean, ministers of education, etc. I was in Montenegro where we hub and spoke. So we were trying to run a program there. We had no presence. The ambassador, our UK ambassador, was also extremely unhappy. And the Minister of Education was very, very vocal about the loss of, so much of what his country needed in terms of education and cultural support, particularly in this area of the young people and disinformation.
If there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in. I hope you found it valuable. I know that we have, and it's been really important to understand where you are at this kind of difficult time for all of you. We've made a note of the things that we hope you're going to write back to us on, which is the £1 million loss in China, the breakdown of different types of fraud, details of the gender pay gap over the last few years. And we will clarify my questions over the fluctuations of net profit and loss in the years since COVID, because I'm afraid I think we were, there was something wrong, and I think it's important to understand, because it doesn't, on the basis of what we were shown, it really doesn't look very good. So if there are explanations, then we do need to have that. And I hope that I speak on behalf of all of the committee by saying that we wish you well and all the best in the next few months. So thank you very much again for your time today.